Hi to everybody. Thanks for being there. And thanks, as always, to the HRB TMRN for the opportunity to speak at events like this, which is really helpful. So you might have heard of the PeRSEVERE project before, and it's been going on for a few years. And I've given various presentations about it before. I thought we should, given that we're kind of at the end of this project, do a slightly different slant on it. So that's what today is about. Sort of reflecting on what we've done and thinking about what comes next, as it says in the title. We will still go over what the thing is for the people who are new to it, and that's fine. So I did actually talk to this webinar series about 3.5 years ago, hence the title there. So if you haven't heard about the project at all since then, this is your update, I guess. So the PeRSEVERE project started from this shared sense that things were not quite satisfactory in how withdrawal in clinical trials was prepared for and managed. The sort of motivating examples that we had within the clinical trials unit network in the UK were things like completed forms about withdrawal, CRFs being sent to us where it wasn't quite clear exactly how a participant's involvement should change, what sort of level of withdrawal there was, or participants not being offered all their choices where there are choices about the levels of withdrawal. So various things, but certainly a shared sense across the network that there was a bit of a problem that needed addressing. And that's where this project came from. Simone's already helpfully written out the title, Principles for Handling End of Participation Events in Clinical Trials Research. In hindsight, that could be a slightly different title, but it's fine. We had two aims over the course of the project. Firstly, to devise guiding principles for how withdrawal and other participation changes should be managed. And then those are kind of high level, and then explore how to implement in a bit more detail. The second bit obviously is more advisory. It's all advisory, but that's particularly sort of just recommendations. We're hoping that the guiding principles could apply to research and clinical trials in lots of different settings, ideally. It's important to say that these aren't all new ideas that we came up with. They're things that people have said before, but this was the first attempt to bring it all together into a comprehensive set of principles that build on existing good clinical practice ideas. I've also said legitimize there. I think what you'll find in the literature previously and maybe in your own experiences is people recommending the sorts of things that we're recommending, but just based on kind of their opinion. We've been through a whole exercise now to try and really nail down what these principles should be and to check them with lots of people and explain how we've done that. So it gives them maybe some more weight to rely on. I'm generally going to use the term participation changes, which is the terminology that we've ended up with in PeRSEVERE, landing on that. Withdrawal we find is not a very helpful term. There's other terms that you might think are unhelpful too, like loss to follow-up or dropout, and these aren't always clear about what they mean. Participation changes, we mean all of those. There's a few things that are out of scope to do with, for example, issues of changes in capacity to consent. That's out of scope. But otherwise, quite a broad definition of what we're including in participation changes there. I'm first going to talk about a couple of main ideas that are not the PeRSEVERE principles themselves, but they're sort of recurring ideas that underpin all of the principles or keep cropping up in the PeRSEVERE principles. Firstly, that participation in clinical trials can stop, reduce, or change. Maybe less so in a small, simple clinical trial, but in lots of clinical trials, there's quite a lot of aspects to participation, and a binary view or binary terminology in language around withdrawal isn't really helpful and doesn't really reflect real life in a lot of cases. We use this hexagon, just could be a different shape, but this is just an example. Participation might involve receiving intervention, attending visits, completing questionnaires, sub-study, data linkage to routinely collected data, biological sample issues, and maybe some other things. And participants' involvement in a clinical trial could change in different ways in respect to these. So we could say they stop intervention, but they carry on everything else, or they stop completing questionnaires and carry on everything else, or in some other more complicated way. But certainly you can see that if we were to just say it's a binary on-off condition, that's not necessarily that helpful. Another really important idea that a lot of the principles are addressing is this idea of finding a balance between some kind of extreme positions. So on the one hand, we could say researchers assume that a participant expressing any indication of doubt about participation means all of those aspects have to stop that we talked about. Maybe you'd agree it's kind of too cautious. It's detrimental to trials. We can see that, things like missing data that could be avoidable, but also it's detrimental to participants who might want to stay involved in some way, and we're saying they can't. On the other hand, we could say researchers reacting to participants' wishes by carrying out the minimum extent of participation change they can get away with. It's an exaggerated example. Or researchers implementing onerous processes around participation changes to find out what patients want. So you could say, you can stop taking part, but only when you fill in this big form telling us what you want to do. That's also ethically difficult, as it says here, and inadequate upholding of participants' rights. It would be detrimental in trials in the long run, because people wouldn't want to take part in under these sorts of conditions. So we need to find a balance between those positions. A middle ground might involve things like in the PeRSEVERE principles, so the extent and nature of participation changes to be informed, freely given decision by the participant themselves as far as possible. There are some caveats to that. Avoiding the assumption that participants' wishes to stop or reduce their participation means all their involvement needs to stop, and a couple of the principles address that. Accepting and being transparent about limitations on participation changes, including undoing work already done. This maybe is quite well understood already, that's true to say. And in some limited and conditional cases, allowing the assumption that previously given informed consent is carrying on. So one example would be in the case of clinician withdrawal, if a doctor advises that treatment or intervention should stop. Under some conditions, we might be able to assume that other aspects of participation would carry on until the participant says they want them to stop. There's more to say about that, and if it was not done in a fair or controlled way, then it would definitely be unethical. But we're suggesting that there is an ethical way to do that. And then finally, and generally, taking a cautious approach. So similarly, applying caveats and conditions and safety nets throughout the approach, so that any assumptions affecting participants' rights are only applied when they're justified. And I've highlighted transparency and fairness as well, which link to the idea of informed consent. People can't make a fair choice if they're not informed about things. So to recap what we have done in the PeRSEVERE project, it started off fairly organically. From my point of view, it started off with me being frustrated about things in my day job and then talking to other people. And this led to lots of discussion and debate within the Clinical Trials Unit network in the UK. I would say we took time for informal consensus. This wasn't a Delphi study or something like that where we're measuring a consensus. We took time to just work out disagreements and figure out compromises on things. Following that, we did a public consultation exercise in 2021, which you may have seen at the time, just asking for any feedback on the drafts that we had. And then we finalized the principles and released them publicly in 2022. We were lucky enough to get a little bit more funding to put together a web resource, which was done mostly during 2023. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit. Just to mention about the consultation itself. So we got 281 people responding to the consultation from 9 countries, but true to say that it's majority UK in that case. The largest group were research professionals, but there was a good amount of patients or people identified as patients, carers, or members of the public. A big group of people big proportion, I should say, who have experience taking part in research. I think that's how the question was worded. So obviously that could be all sorts of things. There were some people, and that's nearly 10% of all of the respondents, who have experience themselves of stopping participation early. So I think that's a useful addition to our results. We were interested to get people with experiences from different sectors. So we mostly from academia, the respondents, but we got some people with pharmaceutical company experience. That's helpful too. I haven't really included sort of the feedback or summary of the feedback, but in short, they didn't substantially disagree with our draft principles, but we were able to make some useful tweaks and additions to them to lead to these final principles. There's 17 of them in total, and maybe that sounds like quite a lot. I'm going to talk about how to navigate them. They come in 4 groups. The first group has got a code O for overarching principles. And these are maybe the most important or most impactful, I guess. These aren't the principles themselves. I've just sort of summarized them here. Firstly, to reiterate that point about participation changes not being a binary thing and being a bit more complicated than that. Secondly, we've addressed who decides on the extent of a participation change. If we're saying that withdrawal is in layers or levels, who decides on the extent of participation changes? And we've said primarily participants themselves, but with some caveats. Decisions should be made about participation changing with the knowledge of the value of data. I think that's something we're all familiar with as researchers, that we are trying to collect as much of the planned data as we can. So we're saying that everybody's decisions, including when participants themselves are making a decision to stop or reduce their involvement, that should be with the knowledge, at least, of the value of data. The principles address this issue of loss of contact. I think mostly people use the term loss to follow-up when they're saying loss of contact, but not always. Hence, we've used this slightly different and hopefully more explicit term, loss of contact. It's not the same as an active decision to stop taking part. We've addressed the issue of when data collection should continue or when it's fairer for it to stop. I guess particularly in cases where data collection for the trial could carry on kind of in the background using routine data, it then becomes a bit more complicated. And the question of data retention, which is quite well addressed by certainly legislation in the UK and European Union. And then finally, we have a principle about separating the end of participation from provision of information, or in other words, just because somebody stops taking part, it doesn't mean they can't have information that they might want or need after that point. And there sometimes is still confusion about that. Beyond that, we've got a group of principles coded D, which initially was for development in that case, which covers things like study design, protocol quality, participant information training, and encouraging dialogue between the stakeholders involved. And then finally, M and R, data management and monitoring, study analysis and reporting. These are quite self-explanatory. In terms of the study analysis one, interestingly, we didn't have that much to add necessarily, because I would say this is an area that's had a lot of attention over the years, i.e. about handling missing data in trial analyses. Reporting obviously is also addressed through the consort statement, but we've made some recommendations about how that could go slightly further. That's all of that in a nutshell. I mentioned this web resource, and this has been public for a few months now. We're still working on sharing it through all of the channels that we want to share it, but doing this webinar is part of sharing it. So feel free to visit that and share it with others. What's next for PeRSEVERE? You may be asking yourself this, and there is a lot of content, and it might not necessarily be easy to know where to start. I've tended to suggest that PeRSEVERE should be used kind of as a toolkit. There is a lot of content. I don't think I would expect many people to read it from front to back. That would seem a bit unrealistic. But it's kind of a toolkit of things to pick up on when you need them. I can think of different scenarios where you might refer to PeRSEVERE. I do refer to it in my day job as a quality assurance manager. If somebody's asking me a question about participation changes or withdrawal or loss to follow-up, and I need to refer to a standard position given in the PeRSEVERE principles, I do that. So firstly, we could talk about planning new studies, preparing for what sorts of participation changes might happen in your study. Could help with things like deciding the approach you're going to take and working out what would be a justified ethical approach to take. Making sure the study processes are as good as possible, and similarly with documents, things like the CRF or data collection form, can it be improved, just to pick a random example. The other area then, and this is maybe a sort of thing that comes to me again in my day job, deciding what to do in ongoing studies in particular situations or scenarios that have come up to do with withdrawal. What would a fair approach be to take? So questions like, how should a participant's level of involvement change? Is it fair to continue data collection, use of samples? What's the right way to go? You might know from your own experience that sometimes these things can be pretty challenging, and it feels, we're all keen to do the right thing. So the idea of PeRSEVERE is to give reassurance about the right approaches and what's a fair approach in this sort of scenario. I don't like the word balance quite, but sort of balancing individuals' rights and the needs of the clinical trial, or doing the best by both of those, we could say. I think there's a role for PeRSEVERE resources in training staff. We want to do a little bit more about providing reusable training materials, but I think it's quite good for setting standards and expectations and being on the same page about what we're trying to do when we're managing participation changes. Those are a few ideas. You might find other uses. We have done this thing on the website, which I've loosely called role-specific guidance. So they're short introductory pages for people with a particular expertise or slant or interest in clinical trials. It also includes public contributors, which I was pleased we managed to do. So in each of these, it covers a little introduction to PeRSEVERE, and then it sort of sets out what that person's role might be and what principles might be most relevant and resources. These were developed with individuals from that stakeholder group, by the way, just to confirm. We also have example scenarios, and I think these can be quite helpful. So again, in terms of navigating the PeRSEVERE resources, so there's currently 5 scenarios, and we might add more. I suppose I'll put that out there, that if you've got some unusual scenario that you've come up with that you think would be a good one to share, we could certainly make it more generic, but we could then share it on the website. That would be interesting. And then for each one, so the scenarios page talks about what should be done, and how the PeRSEVERE principles can help prepare for that scenario. I've just copied and pasted one of the scenarios here so you can see what sort of thing. It talks about sharing summary of study results with the study's participants. And you've recorded different participants as having different levels of withdrawal in your trial data. So working out who it's fair to contact, and which PeRSEVERE principles help address that and help work that out. In terms of what happens next beyond PeRSEVERE, we're just tying up the loose ends of the existing project, I guess. There's 2 broad areas, we could say, which I'm going to cover on the next slides, kind of meshed in with each other. I'll touch on both of them. But putting the PeRSEVERE principles into practice, I've compared it a bit to informed consent in general in the past. So you might recognize that informed consent is hard to do perfectly. It's hard for consent to be perfectly informed and perfectly voluntary, perhaps, if that's not too awkward a thing to say. And I think similarly with the case of participation changes, it's hard to do it perfectly. We're just trying to get that right balance as best as we can. I think the PeRSEVERE project has brought up some opportunities for research, or a slightly new area of research that maybe hasn't been considered on its own before. So I'm going to touch on those things as well. I think it's interesting to reflect on how PeRSEVERE relates to the question of retention research. So when we talk about that, we're talking about this question of how can we keep people involved in clinical trials to collect the data that we need and produce more robust results. I'm suggesting here we could kind of break that down into several slightly different questions. I've seen retention research that's talking about behavior, so making people less likely to decide to stop taking part. Valid question. There's then a question of burden, like if we make trials really easy for people to complete, maybe that will keep more people involved because it's not really a problem for them to be involved. I think there's a slightly different question arising from PeRSEVERE, which is how I've termed here resilience. Can we design and run trials in a way that reduces the impact of whatever decisions people make? So people want to stop or reduce their participation, but the trial can cope with it, if that makes sense. I think there's a really important thing to say about data quality, and that means data about participation changes. One of our PeRSEVERE principles addresses that, and you can see that the better the data is about participation changes, this can really support retention research. And the inverse is true. If we don't have good information about withdrawal and participation changes, how can we really research it? How can we compare studies between each other? So I think that's an important aspect as well. The next slide is sort of slightly miscellaneous list of things that that we've done and that help put PeRSEVERE principles into practice. I'm going to touch a bit on the possible research question, I guess, with each one. So alongside the PeRSEVERE principles themselves, there's a bit of explanatory text, but I mentioned this implementation guidance. We brought it together from all of the different suggestions that people had thrown in through the consultation, through the development of the principles in the first place. Also a review of the literature. So it's quite a comprehensive thing, and as a result, it's pretty detailed, and again, not for reading front to back, but more of a toolkit, a reference guide. On the website, it's under that link, PeRSEVERE in Practice, and it includes guidance, detailed guidance on things like protocol development, patient information, training and support, etc. Plenty of guidance there. One thing we've done is produce some template patient information wording. That's via the resources page. So that's a thing we did last year with a group of patients, and a useful little exercise. So from the implementation guidance and the PeRSEVERE principles themselves, we had an idea of what we thought could be in patient information sheet wording. And so that exercise was involved talking through with that patient group and working out some example or template wording. That's just a screenshot. It's layered information, which is, I guess, increasingly seen as a useful way to reduce the information burden on individuals. So we've got a short little section that still includes what we want to say, and then more detail for those who want it. So thinking about possible effects on trial retention, first thing to say is that it includes this bit about the awareness of the value of data collection. I can't remember off the top of my head how we worded it, but there was, a good amount of discussion in the group about how to word that fairly, along the lines of every contribution you can make to this would be useful. So some chance that with awareness of the value of data, some participants might be happy to reduce their involvement as opposed to completely stop. That could be the hypothesis. There's also more in there about choices and being clear from the start that when you start taking part in a clinical trial, it's not that your only option is to completely stop taking part, withdraw from the trial, but also you might be able to reduce or change how you participate. And it's just that knowledge of choices. Again, maybe that means more people would be willing to reduce their involvement and still provide primary outcome data, as opposed to completely stopping. These are hypotheses, untested, so more work needed for all of these. A second thing we've done is about end of participation information. This was a separately funded thing that actually we started in about 2020. The main question being, what information might participants need or want around the time they stop taking part? The questions participants might be asking themselves, like, what does stopping my involvement early mean for me? Have I still made a useful contribution, and so on? We might think that this is all in the information sheet and the original patient information sheet, and that's, of course, a good idea to include all of that stuff. But I know from talking to research participants that sometimes people feel like they don't have much information and that they're kind of cut off at that stage. I think sometimes from a researcher point of view, there's uncertainty about the ethics, if you like, the right thing to do when it comes to contacting participants who've stopped taking part. But people do sometimes want information, seek information at that stage. So it's a good idea to provide it to those who want it. This is linked via the PeRSEVERE website, but it's on a separate website. Possible effects on trial retention. Thinking about, again, about awareness of choices. That's a slightly different scenario. Then you're reminding people of their choices around the time they stop taking part. And slightly more complicatedly, maybe there's more chance that participants are definitely involved in those decisions about the extent of their change. I've certainly seen cases in the past where we in a clinical trials unit would get a report of like a complete withdrawal from everything. But then when you look into it and you ask what's going on at the trial site, and even if you look in the medical notes, if you're monitoring in that way, there's not that much evidence of it. So there's some suspicion that the participant hasn't actually been involved in that decision about the extent of their change. So if you provide confirmation of the extent of the change to the participant, maybe that means they're more likely to be involved. That's a slightly complicated argument, but again, is a possible hypothesis. This is not a resource, but it's just one of the PeRSEVERE principles. It says studies should be designed and resourced to allow data collection to continue wherever possible. Participants should be allowed to continue while making less commitment to the study where it's feasible, where it's safe, where it doesn't negatively affect the scientific integrity. And it might not be possible for those reasons sometimes. I think we've learned a lot following the pandemic, basically, where we had to pivot and find new ways of doing things to allow studies to carry on. And it's a similar idea, really, links to that idea of resilience that I mentioned earlier. What we mean in practice is a choice of data collection options, so that somebody's finding one difficult, there might be another option for them. The obvious possible effect on trial retention is some participants accepting reduced or changed participation who would otherwise stop altogether if there was no option like that. Another of the PeRSEVERE principles is about better training. Everyone involved in running studies should be trained and supported to manage participation changes. You could say this is kind of covered by good clinical practice and so forth, that covers training. That's a bit more, I would say, on the sort of compliance side, make sure everybody's trained and qualified. We were keen to put the word support in here because I've mentioned that this is all can be quite complicated and challenging, maybe particularly for people who are directly engaging with participants, because those can be challenging conversations to have. So people should be supported to do that. Again, we're talking about giving people confidence in the approaches to take, skills to manage difficult conversations or interactions, and recognizing that it's challenging. Possible effects on retention. maybe more chance that recruiters communicate this value of data, value of retention to potential participants, maybe more chance that participants are aware of their choices, and maybe more chance of good decisions being made at a clinical trials unit or equivalent, as in everybody's on the same page that I mentioned before. In the PeRSEVERE guidance, we have written a bit about a few other ways to support participants' decision making. And some of these are done a bit in practice already, but others less so. Firstly is about informing participants' decisions. So it might be hard to intervene in this way when somebody's thinking of stopping taking part. If there's some opportunity to remind them about what their choices are, I can see that people might feel uncomfortable about that in some situations, but that's not impossible, I don't think. Secondly, using an optional form to record participants' wishes. It's got to be optional. I don't think, like I mentioned before, we can say you must fill in this form before you stop taking part. But I think we'd flip that and say it's really helpful to us and to you if you confirm to us what you want to do. Some people are doing that already, but it's not widespread. Again, a slightly new idea, I think, an opportunity for participants to discuss their participation with someone independent of the usual research staff. There would be questions about who that would be. I've seen in some pharmaceutical sponsored clinical trials this idea of, what do they call it, a concierge, which is quite a pharmaceutical company thing to say perhaps, but somebody who the participant can talk to and get support from, who's not their usual care team. It's an interesting idea. There's questions about how to deliver it in practice, obviously. A route to stop participation without having to speak to anyone. I think we'd primarily be talking about an online portal, for example. There's definitely pros and cons to that. A worry might be people stopping taking part in a way that isn't totally informed. If they're just going via that route, there's no chance to have anything asked of them. They're just going to go via that route on their own. But again, from my experiences talking to research participants, sometimes people feel awkward about telling the research staff that they want to stop, so they just don't. So they just go silent. This is one reason for why that happens. Finally, there might be possibilities to do with e-consent, and you might know this term dynamic consent. So participants being able to have quite a lot of control over their consent over time, over their level of consent to the things they're agreeing to or not anymore. And perhaps e-consent offers some possibilities with that. It's kind of similar to that point about a route for stopping participation without speaking to anyone. So there's a few things bundled up there. But again, some possible effects in terms of trial retention, or on the number of lost contacts. So that's maybe the pro of that one about stopping participation without speaking to anyone. Maybe there's some people who currently would prefer to just kind of slip off the radar, who might use that online portal, and then we might have a bit more information, which might be worth it. So otherwise here, again, more awareness of choices and pros and cons of each, better data about what participants want to do, less reliance on assumptions, which seems good from everybody's point of view. More information about participants' wishes where otherwise there might be none. And reduce risk of pressure in the decision or its communication, people feeling awkward. Maybe it's good to allow them a way out of that. Nearly at the end of all of this. Thinking about data collection as a slightly separate area. I mentioned we've got this principle where we talk about how it's important to collect data about participation changes to usefully inform study management, analysis, and reporting. So all of those, there's an obvious reason to do with analysis and missing data, but also study management is really important. We need to know what people have stopped. And also, if we were able to collect kind of feedback through that route, you could improve studies as they're ongoing. Anyway, it's an interesting area. Where available, collect data about when and why participation reduced or stopped. Yeah. We're doing a piece of work currently to look at what data teams are currently collecting. There's some prior publications to do with what's reported in trials about withdrawal and reasons for withdrawal. But we're looking at what trial teams are actually collecting, and we'll have something to share on that later in the year. So some things we could say about this: standardization might make it easier for research staff to ask and participants to say, this is completely hypothetical. But you imagine at the moment, it's quite an open question, perhaps, like, are you happy to say why you want to stop? That's quite an open question and possibly quite daunting. Whereas if it was turned into something like a simple checklist of things that we may be interested to know about, and we don't need more detail than that, maybe that would make that interaction a bit easier for everybody. Possible beneficial effects on analysis and reporting of better quality data. I've mentioned about benefits to retention research, and I've mentioned about feedback for ongoing trials. So lots of possible benefits for better data about participation changes. Finally, to touch on some other live and planned resources, just FYI, really, we've got some checklists for managing individual participation changes. So I guess that's like when they're ongoing, making sure we're going through all the right steps to manage them from a kind of trial management point of view. We've got some suggested terminology. Really, we're not saying everybody needs to use that terminology, just that we need to communicate clearly with one another, particularly when it comes to understanding what's changed in relation to each participation change. What's the level of withdrawal? And then some further things that we're planning, protocol wording that's aligned with the PeRSEVERE principles, flow diagrams similar to the checklist idea, really like working out what's changed, what should change in each case, each participation change, and training slides for different groups, so reusable things. There's so many people I could thank about this, so I've unfortunately bundled them all up into two statements, and thanks to those of you on the call if you have been involved in helping push PeRSEVERE forward. Really grateful to the support from UKCRC Registered CTU Network and NIHR in the UK. So that's the end of my talk. Any questions?